Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here with everyone. I've had a chance to visit with a lot of you beforehand, and I hope to visit with the rest of you after the program. Um, as Mark said, uh, we both started out in Washington. Mark worked for Senator Paul Simon from Illinois, and I worked for Senator Lloyd Bentsen from Texas. And both members could not be more different. Senator Simon was very relaxed, and Senator Bentsen was very uptight. So I would go by and see Mark's office, and they were all having such a good time in that office. And I was like, how can you be having a good time? I'm miserable over here. So of course we became friends. And so I wanted to start off with a little bit of a photo bio. Because I think it helps to kind of just give you the feel for where I started and where I am and what I've done. I was born in San Antonio, Texas. These are pictures of my father, who was a barber, and my mother, who was a housewife. And if you could see the little sign behind him, haircuts were 50 cents and a shave was 35 cents. And that little barbershop was the economic engine that propelled myself and my sister forward. And all of us probably can relate to some of these things, but when I was growing up, my parents made a big effort to send me to Catholic school. And at the time, it was $5 a month if you had one child, and $8 a month for two children or more. So when I attribute so much of my good fortune to the Catholic education of Sacred Heart nuns, who themselves were not necessarily college graduates. I mean, they really just handled whatever was thrown at them, and they did it very well. When I went to high school, I went to Central Catholic High School. The tuition then was $25 a month, so kept getting more and more. I then went on to the University of Texas at Austin, and what I tell most people, and they find it very hard to believe, but I did a BA, an MA, and a JD for under $10,000, which was pretty remarkable. You can't buy a car for $10,000. But that was, that all of this foundation came relatively modest ways, but it totally propelled me, and I felt completely ready for the challenges that were ahead of me. As I mentioned, after law school, I worked in Mexico City, and then practicing international copyright and patent law, and then I came back to Austin, and then came to Washington to work for Lloyd Bentsen, and it was really a game changer. It really changed my life. But in a weekend, after I got there, I pretty much knew that I loved it, and that has been sort of the history of what happened after getting to Washington. Just for good measure, my daughter just graduated a few years ago from Boston University, and my son graduates this May from West Point. So here's where it started. I had worked in the 1988 campaign. I was the National Deputy Campaign Manager for Paul Simon. And then by Super Tuesday, that was over. And so I sort of folded into the Dukakis-Bentsen campaign. And because I had worked for Bentsen, I was made the liaison between the presidential and the vice presidential campaign. And so, as you know, it didn't work out for Dukakis. But I had been tasked to do a celebrity fly-around to basically take Latino celebrities to key demographic states to gin up the base for the election. Now, you might think that in today's world that's not too hard to do, but at the time there was no internet, there was no IMDb, there was no cell phones, and somehow I did it, and that's how I began to develop one foot in politics and one foot in entertainment. These are the co-founders, Jimmy Smits, Meryl Julia, who's the widow of Raul Julia, myself, Sonia Braga, and Isai Morales. And together we all came together. Jimmy would say to me, we had done an event for President Clinton in San Antonio. And Jimmy said to me, and I met them all on the fly-around trip, so that's how I got to know them. Jimmy said, I don't really know what we're accomplishing. He said, because I get on the plane and I know I have all these great pictures of the president and Hillary and Al and, you know, Tipper, but I don't know what I've really accomplished. And I said, well, it's because you don't have a place for the quid pro quo. And I used it first. And I said, you don't have any place for them to, if you asked them to do something for you, they would do it, but you don't have anywhere to ask. He said, well, what could we do? I said, well, you know, everywhere I'm with you, people say, I have a son, I have a daughter, they want to be an actor or a writer. Can you help them get a spot on your show? Can you introduce them to your managers? And he really couldn't do any of that stuff. I said, but if we created a foundation that created a pipeline and helped to mentor students that are at the graduate school level at prestigious schools that have a direct pipeline into the industry, we could really build up a number of, you know, talented people to go forward. And he said, you think we could do that? And it was sort of our Thelma and Louise moment. And we just, on the back of an envelope, I said, yeah. And I had no idea what I'd committed myself to, but we jumped off the cliff and we're still here. So, you know, thank you. When we look at, you know, I've broken it down into Latinos in film and Latinos in television. And I'm going to go through some numbers. There's no quiz at the end, so don't worry. You know, we look at how individual Latino directors between 2007 and 2018, and this was a study that was done by USC Annenberg, and they looked at the top grossing 1,200 films between that sort of almost 10-year period. Of that 10-year period, of all those films, there were just 28 films that had been directed by Latinos. And 29% of them were US filmmakers, but the majority were, 71% were international Latino directors. So the issue has always been about how do we encourage the growth of US Latinos into this industry. And that has really been one of the key issues that we look at. When you look at the characters that people play, you know this by heart. I mean, they're criminal, they're low income, they're immigrants, they're religious, they're isolated, they're, you know, they're temperamental. That's the way the industry sort of creates a caricature of who we are. But that's not just who sees it in the United States, it's throughout the world, because our entertainment industry is worldwide. So, you know, you start out in a very negative place. In fact, 77% of all of the US and the territories, there are more Latinos, 77% more than there are in films. So it just shows you the numbers that Mark was talking about. That we're gaining so much ground, and yet we're still so marginalized, and that's really the problem. Across all those years that we were looking at, the average is still just about 4.5% of characters in films, when we're 18% of the population. And you'll see films that are in New York where you don't have a single Latino, or in California, there's no Latinos there. Those are the big places, and you can imagine if it's in Connecticut, they're going to totally erase us from the picture, because that's not the way that they want to tell the narrative, or the way they understood the narrative, and they don't really need it for a plot point, and that becomes part of the problem. Latinos on TV, we're doing better, and you know, streamers have really changed that whole equation. Netflix in 2019 spent $15 billion, that's with a B. And in 2020, they're expected to spend $17 billion, and by 2026, they're expected to spend $26 billion. Now that's just Netflix. That doesn't include Amazon and Hulu and Apple and everybody else that, you know, has gotten into streaming, and the amount of money. That's why I say, and I was talking with some of the university professors and heads of the university, that this is a recession-proof economy. I mean, you know, it's like in Washington, because of all the defense contracting and federal government contract, we're pretty much in a recession-proof economy there. But if instead of thinking, you know, I want my son, my daughter to become a doctor or a lawyer, they should become a producer. They should become an executive. You know, this is where media is not going away. It's not going to get less. It's going to get more. And so this directioning, you know, young people into this field is not the bad thing we used to think entertainment was. So that's a very important part to it. Netflix also announced that they were going to produce in Mexico 50 films and television series. And already they have, you know, phenomenal shows that are on: Narcos, Mexico, Roma, La Casa de las Flores, Club de Cuervos, Money Heist, Elite. I mean, you can see some of you may have seen some of these shows that are already, you know, in Spanish. What are they doing to Televisa, the main production company? Well, they're eating their lunch. And in many ways, they've done a lot of good things. They've sort of upgraded the storyline content. They've matured the characters. They've brought relevance. They've brought, you know, they've taken it away from the poor Hispanic girl beautiful Hispanic girl who falls in love with the rich European guy. And this is the telenovela kind of format that, you know, got repeated and repeated and repeated. We all watched them and watched them and watched them. Well, now they have a whole lot of choice, and there's a lot of comedy, and there's a lot of drama, and there's a lot of science fiction. So there are many things that are happening on that front, which are all very positive. But I say to Netflix, if you're going to do 50 films and series out of Mexico, couldn't you do 10 U.S. Latino kind of themed content that really talks about who we are today and not some other substituting one stereotype for another stereotype? That's really the problem, is that the industry is working it's like complete darkness, and they can't see what we see, and they can't understand what we tell them, and they can't believe it because they can't see it. And so it's the chicken and the egg with what happens here. I mean, think of here's some of the series without Latino characters: Big Little Lies, Fleabag, The Kominsky Method. Okay, so you may say, well, Fleabag is in Britain. You know, Spain is right next door. And do you know how many Venezolanos live in Spain? How many Cubans live in Spain? I mean, you know, Mexicans that live in Spain. I mean, in the Latin world, you move in these countries quite easily. And so, you know, there's no reason why you couldn't find characters. Big Little Lies, I mean, that is one, I'm sure many of you have seen that show. It's set in Monterey, California. There's not a single Hispanic on the show, okay? I looked it up today. There are 17.8% Latinos in Monterey, California. But see, this is how the storyline they think doesn't need it, why confuse people. But that's where the mistakes start to happen, even with shows that we really like and that we see and we recognize that. Here's some of the shows that are out there. And the first one is a recent show, Party of Five. You may remember the old Party of Five that aired about, I don't know, it was maybe 20 years ago. It was about 5 kids whose parents die in a car crash, and they're left to raise themselves, and it was all of the problems and dilemmas that went on for them. Well, this setting is even more poignant. It's 5 kids who are effectively orphaned when their 2 parents are deported to Mexico. The oldest is a DACA recipient, and the other 4 are U.S. citizens. It's so poignant, so timely. You know, you're probably saying, I've never seen it. Well, it's because it's on Freeform, which is a channel owned by ABC, but it streams on Hulu. So if that helps, you know, hopefully you'll watch that. That is a really good show. All of these other shows are, you know, are making a huge hit. NCIS with Wilmer Valderrama. Do you know that show is the #1 show in the world in terms of viewership, and it's translated into all these different languages. And Cote Pablo, you may remember her. She plays Ziva, the Israeli Mossad character. she's Chilean American. I mean, this is what's so exciting. She's such a good actress, you know, and everyone thinks, you know, she had to be, you know, Israeli or because she does that role so well. Well, that's called acting. We actually know, we actually can do it. This is a very interesting slide. It looks at the words that demean us when talking about immigrants. And CNN did approximately a third more stories on immigrants. And Fox did so much less, but it used these words so much more. And they're words like, you know, infest and invade, you know, rodent, criminal, murder in relation to immigrants. And, you know, it's like we have this double-edged sword. You know, as many of us are multi-generational U.S. Latinos, and we have empathy for that immigrant that is coming over. But as a multi-generational Latino, we're not necessarily anymore an immigrant per se. We're just a full-fledged regular American. And that becomes the conflict that we can only be seen through one lens, which is the lens of immigration. And that is part of the problem of how setting up the conversation and not being able to go beyond that conversation. This is a study that we helped to underwrite. And it's an old study in today's terms. It's a 2014 study. It's very hard to pay for these studies. It's very hard they're very labor intensive. They require so much documentation. And unfortunately, they all wind up saying the same thing, that our numbers are growing and we're very marginalized and underrepresented. We are, probably the most important number here is that we are 25% of the box office. Now, we're 18%, so we over-index to go to see films. We over-index in media and digital media and streaming media. I mean, cell phone usage. We're a part of the business. We should be a part of the business plan of all of these companies. And as a major component of that company, there should be a way to market to us in a way that's relevant. But here's what happened. We have a good external message, which we can talk to the industry about, and they get that message. But the internal message, our own community doesn't understand the importance of representation and the image that gets put out there about us. So the conversation has to be at an earlier age of getting, you know, young adapters, young students to understand that you need to be represented, and it needs to be reflective of the way that you think of the world right now. Because otherwise, they're going to put you in a box. And when people see you walking down the street, they're going to put you in that box that they've seen on TV. And these are the problems that we really face in making change happen, because the industry sees it as, they know that 25% is going to show up for a Tom Cruise film or anything else, and that they're not asking that Tom Cruise have as a co-star a Latino in the film, or that the James Bond film have a Latino in the film. And so their attitude is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And so they will nod their head and say they understand what we're saying, but they don't make the changes. So basically the blue line is the population going up, and the other two lines are the lack of representation that happens in television. What happens when it comes to news? We're so small in terms of what stories that get told about us, and the majority of those stories, like 66%, are about crime, terrorism, illegal immigration, and so it gets distorted. Even when they do tell a story about us, it stays within that box, and that's all that people can really see when they do. So what have we done in terms of these programs? We've tried to basically build on this, create diversity, advocacy. We do graduate school scholarships, we do outreach, we do audience and industry research. We do content development, talent development, by establishing a national conversation. And this is really civil rights. This is really civil rights in the digital age. And our co-founders, you know, I mean, some of you may remember that Isai Morales was the character you most remember from La Bamba. And that film in 1987 dollars made $100 million worldwide. And Isai could not get a career in film until most recently. And even when he was cast in Ozark. I mean, some of you may have seen that on Netflix, as, you know, again, the narco traficante murderer, you know. But everybody said he was really good, you know, in that role. So, you know, this is what happens is, you know, yeah, you do get roles, and the roles are very predictable, and, you know, there we go. So we've you know, gone through and done so many things that help us make changes. One of the things that we did was on Saturday Night Live. You know, Lorne Michaels is like a god at NBC. He's the producer and the creator of Saturday Night Live. You know, for 39 years, when you know, they had never hired a Latina cast member, and so I pushed and pushed and, you know, talked to all of their executives, and finally they acquiesced and they hired Melissa Villaseñor. And yet she's kind of underutilized on the show, but she's been on the show, and they now have her on the show. But it just shows you that you have to speak up, and you've got to deal with these things. The same thing happened with the Kennedy Center Honors, which the Kennedy Center Honors were started in the Carter administration by George Stevens Jr. And he became, when the Reagans came in, they said, oh my God, can we invite some of our Hollywood friends? And at that moment, that's when it started to really become a big event in Washington. And it grew and became very profound, and that was kind of the biggest thing. That's our biggest, you know, Oscar night that we have in Washington. But they kept refusing to honor Latinos. And I kept writing every year. They would announce the names, and I would write a pro forma letter to the president of the Kennedy Center, Michael Kaiser, and I would say, you know, you've issued this again, and there are no Latinos on your list, and it's been 10 years since the last Latino got, you know, named. You know, what is the problem? And this one year, he called me. I was driving my daughter to a ballet store in Frederick, and you know, he came over the radio basically. And she was hearing the conversation, and I said to him, you know, he says, you shouldn't be judging us just by that one show. We do all these other things that are relevant to Latinos. And I said, so we're talking separate but equal, you know? And he said, and he, of course, he couldn't have, there was no answer. I was right. And so he used a profanity to me. He told me to go F myself. And my daughter immediately put her arm out, and she says, don't overreact. You know, I mean, I guess she already had been around me too much to know that I was ready to kill him, you know, for saying that. The following day, I was doing an interview at NPR, and I told them about what was happening with the Kennedy Center, and they said, oh, we've got to go back in the studio and record this. It became a front page story in the Washington Post, and no one wanted to address the fact that Latinos had been, you know, had not been awarded these awards from the Kennedy Center, and it became, you know, a big scandal. I remember the night that David Rubenstein called me, and you know, he really didn't understand the issue. He says, well, tell me again why Latinos should be, you know, awarded the Kennedy Center Honor. And I said, it's part of the Kennedy legacy. I said, in 1960, Jackie Kennedy, on the back of pickup trucks in Texas, talked in Spanish to the Latino community to vote for her husband, to a president of the United States. That was the first time there was Spanish language ads, or, you know, targeting to this particular voting group. And LBJ understood that the Latino in Texas would respond to the Catholic Irishman, and the two would be forever tied together. And that's what happened. And I said, this is the Kennedy Center. You forgot the legacy of the Kennedy origin to the presidency. And that then became, Mrs. Obama, was furious, when they realized, I said, how can you have Mrs. Obama, how can you have the president attend an event that excludes Latinos? And I said, and how can you have Caroline Kennedy giving out these awards, when it's against her father's legacy? Well, I mean, I had them in a tizzy because, because they knew I was right. Well, in the end, they fired the president of the Kennedy Center. Well, he was let go gently. And the person who had really been against this was George Stevens Jr. And they had to eventually let him go. Now, here's an interesting tidbit about that part. Some of you may remember his father was George Stevens Sr., who was a very big Hollywood producer who produced this incredible film called Giant. In that storyline of Giant, it's Rock Hudson and Elizabeth Taylor are in the film, and their son, who's a young doctor, marries a Mexican woman, and that was the crisis of the film. And the arc of the film was that by the time they had the child and they were in a diner having dinner, and somebody yelled an epithet to the child, something like, "Get that papoose out of here." Then Rock Hudson said, "That's my grandchild." It changed this dynamic tremendously because of that one moment. And that was George Stevens Sr. But George Stevens Jr., the son, apparently didn't agree with that and didn't really want to have Latinos in his show. And one of the persons that we were trying to get the award, we thought, was Rita Moreno. I mean, she had received, an Oscar, an Emmy, a Grammy, and he said that she was a one-trick pony who was never going to get the award as long as he was there. Well, she got it the next year when they were not there. But it just shows you, how unbelievable, you have to confront so much of this, because people, they won't listen to the logic, they won't listen to it. You have to really, find a way to confront wrong. And in the most recent thing, I was just the last 2 days having an issue with MSNBC, because MSNBC, Chris Matthews resigned because of problems that he had had previously, but he resigned from his show Hardball. And so I immediately sent to Phil Griffin over at MSNBC an email in which I said, now you have an opportunity to hire a Latino or a Latina in prime time to basically do this show. And of course, that's not the first person that they think of. And so then, using social media, I put together a list of about 20 respected journalists who could easily do that show if they wanted them, both internally from MSNBC, NBC, and Telemundo, because they're all under Comcast, and outside from other major networks and cable news. And I also then, on election night, which we just went through on Super Tuesday, CNN did not have a single Latino commentator to talk about the Latino vote, even though Texas and California were in play. So I sent another email to Jeff Zucker, saying, I want a meeting and I want to know why. We value that you have really given a lot of thought to Latino diversity on the network, but when you don't have Latino commentators on this very important night explaining what the impact is of the Latino vote, you are underrepresenting us. The coverage is lacking. So it's an ongoing, it doesn't stop. And what we've tried to do is, build up the base of our own young people, working with Congressman Castro and his brother Julian. Congressman Castro is the chairman of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, and he took a CODEL, a congressional delegation, to Hollywood last summer to be able to talk to the industry and to get to the bottom of why we can't make headway in terms of representation mostly at the film studios. And so this month in March, we're expecting at probably the last week of March, the House Judiciary Committee will hold a hearing on this issue of underrepresentation, not just about Latinos, but about all groups that are underrepresented. And the industry is really, they're perplexed because, they didn't ever think that they'd get challenged in that way. But this is where it's gotten, and this is why there's so much urgency that goes on. I also this is the FCC Commissioner, Jessica Rosenworcel, who is also from Connecticut originally, worked very closely with the FCC on all of the policy issues, related to privacy, spectrum, broadband. And so it's an all-encompassing work that has to be done. And again, it's really about diversity advocacy, and it's about recognizing that we are it is civil rights in the digital age. The schools that we work with, USC, UCLA, NYU, Columbia, Yale, Harvard, Northwestern, and the University of Texas at Austin. And the reason that we work with those schools at the graduate school level in film programs, producing programs, and acting programs is because the industry recognizes those schools as being preeminent. And if the whole world of Hollywood is about networking, who you know is how you get these jobs. So if you come up and you try to, and you're up for these jobs, if you don't have that pedigree, if you don't have that excellence behind you, you're not even going to be considered because there's a friend somewhere lurking who they would rather hire. So, it's, again, it's about doing outreach to the industry, and it's about doing all the things that we do from these pitch programs where we have students basically pitch their content ideas to diverse platforms and trying to get this content developed and done. We worked with the Academy, and again, it's about a national conversation on this issue. It's, again, an important part of what we do. Some of our sponsors that we have here. This is the breakdown of the work that we do. And, I appreciate the opportunity to be here and speak to you all. And I hope I've shared some things that you may not have known. Thank you.
I'm curious to know if in your many years of working with the foundation, you have tried to get at the root as to why is it fundamentally why Latinos have been left out or have been made invisible. Is it ignorance? Is it plain racism? Is it laziness on the part of the executives? Or is it just because nobody has been lobbying for them?
Well, what's hard about this is that, we want to think about the entertainment industry as one thing, and it's not. It's, you have talent agencies that have their own role. You have the network executives that have their own role. You have, different components that basically intersect with each other. There are very few on-ramps to get into this industry. And by an on-ramp, I mean, like, for example, if there's a job behind the camera, if you are not a part of the guild, you can't apply for that job. So it's always this sort of chicken and the egg. If you have not appeared on television, you can't get into SAG-AFTRA. If you're not a part of the Directors Guild, you can't direct, even though you went to school in directing, and you've done independent films. It doesn't count. So there's so many different aspects I think that the industry is ripe for disruption. The streaming totally disrupted delivery of content. And now we have to have a disruption as to how content gets created and how it gets, given a chance to develop, because it's always about, knocking on this door, knocking on that door, and trying to see who will take something. I was just at Sundance and met Josefina Lopez, who is the woman who wrote Real Women Have Curves. And she told me that I think when she was 20, she wrote wrote it as a play for herself to star in. And it took her like 11 years before she could make that film. And at that point, she had aged out on the role. And America Ferrara was the one who took the role, and her career took off from that. It's now taken 20 years, and they're thinking of making this into a television series. And there's also talk of trying to bring it to Broadway as a musical. But to see how long that 20 years, Isai, who did La Bamba, who couldn't, extend it into another important role. I mean, his first film was a film called Bad Boys with Sean Penn. And Isai was amazing in that film. But look, Sean Penn, becomes a huge actor. And Isai struggles to do, he does amazing work, but to get those parts that are really, Emmy worthy or Oscar worthy, that becomes the other part of the conversation, is that we do get roles, but they're so secondary that you're not even going to get a supporting actor role nomination, one. Two, even if, you're a lead in that, it's not a show, Fast and Furious is not going to get nominated for an Oscar. So, I mean, the good news is that we do have things coming up. Lin-Manuel Miranda from Hamilton blew everything out of the water. I mean, he didn't make something that was just Latino focused. He made something that the whole world could appreciate. And they're making the remake of his film, of his play, In the Heights, which gets released in June of 2020. And that film, I predict, is going to be a huge success story because it's got great music and got great dancing and got great young actors that are in there, and that's sort of that next generation that will be propelled from that film. But hopefully they will have somewhere to go, because unlike the situation where Isai's film did 100 million worldwide, which was at the time phenomenal, but there was nowhere for him to go. There was nowhere, to get these big parts. So, we've had some people that have had successes, and we can all point to Raul Julia, for example, in his early successes, and, Kiss of the Spider Woman, and Gomez in The Addams Family, and, things like that. But we haven't seen anything, on a consistent basis. We have one little moment, one little moment, one little moment. And we're really trying to put this emphasis that, it's time for people to acknowledge who we are, to give us the diversity of content that we know we would watch and be interested in, and to present us in a way that is not a fear tactic for, for the right or for the left. I mean, this is the interesting part about it. We get hit with rhetoric from the right that's harsh and, and wrong-headed and insulting. But who puts us in there? The left, Hollywood, who are the funders, the major funders of the Democratic Party. I mean, we are, you get hit from the right, and you get hit from the left. And that is the squeeze that we're seeing. And I think you see it even in the elections. I mean, I think you see that there's a young people that don't want to surrender to, to a system that isn't working for them. I mean, when you're out, when you don't even have a Latino commentator on Super Tuesday, it's a total example of being marginalized and erased from the picture.
Why has our largest networks, such as Telemundo, Univision, why have they not evolved with their production, with their content? Because the storylines are really unrelatable. And
Well,
yet they hold so much market share. And so it's really sad that the production the content of what they're putting out is not relatable.
Yeah, I mean, there's, we're not a simple community, right? We have Spanish language content, and we have English language content. And if you're a multi-generational, you are watching more English language content than you are Spanish language content. And even though, like I put the subtitles on because they speak too fast, and I can't catch everything. So I need to make sure that I'm, getting the English subtitle with the Spanish, and it helps my Spanish to begin with. So I mean, but I'm watching Netflix for that content, which I never had before. I mean, not since I was a child, and I watched it with my grandmother, who was addicted to telenovelas, and that's really how I even understood and learned Spanish, was through telenovelas. But what happens is that there's a transformation occurring, and actually Telemundo made a lot of changes to its content because they had to compete against the imported content of Televisa. And they created their own production studios with basically super series that were like U.S. television. They had a season, and then they were off, and then they came back for another season. And unlike the classic telenovela that has like 99 episodes all in a row and has a beginning and an end, these television series do not have a beginning and an end. They continue on for as long as they have the viewership. So Telemundo has changed the dynamic a lot. Netflix has changed the dynamic a lot. And we know that Univision was just bought last week. And so the changes that are going to, we don't even know what the changes will occur, but a lot of it was that they were losing audience share. And they were not the prime network to watch Spanish language content. So, I mean, everybody is being impacted by this disruption of content, delivery and creation. Yes, sir.
First, thank you for the context, because I think a lot of us are painfully aware of a lot of what you've just said, but the data just reminds us how bad it is, and it's not getting any better. That said, I'd like to turn the page and ask you questions about print media and local television. So what advice could you offer us as a community here in Connecticut to begin addressing this problem?
Well, I think we are in a different place than we were 20 years ago because of social media. And I think that, I know that people don't have, the Kardashian level of tweets, followers. But if you strategically write a tweet and CC the key parts of, the newspaper that you want to respond to, or the broadcast station, or the entity that you feel offended by, or as in your case about getting the poets there and using the Twitter to be an effective way to communicate criticism, you'd be surprised how that really does change the way people start to think about these things, because you put it front and center. And if you can get a core of people to lift up that tweet, which is a little word that I learned this week, is that lifting up the tweet is to comment on the tweet, to forward the tweet. But now you have sort of, 10 people, wow, that really starts to make sense to them, that if 10 people feel that way, that may be amplified to 100 people that are thinking that way. And it's a question of being assertive without being, making mistakes of being overly aggressive, but stating the facts and making it clear and asking those questions as to why underrepresentation exists in that particular issue that you're concerned about. And I think that we used to write letters. You could write letters to the editor. You could write letters to the networks. You could send telegrams to the White House. Well, now, we have a different way of getting it out there. And I think we should really invest in learning how to use that more effectively.
I want to thank you very much for your presentation. It's been really informative, and the work that the foundation is doing. And the problem is so big, as you say. We are underrepresented in front of the camera and in film, et cetera. but we're underrepresented behind the
Yes.
camera, in the places of power, in the rooms where these decisions are made as what goes on in television or in the movies. What can we do, or what are you doing to address that issue? Because that's where change needs to be made.
Yeah, good questions, Yvette. And I'll tell you two things that we've been working on. One is the tax credits that locations give to have productions produced in their area. So the tax credit is a state and local entity device by which they entice production companies to come and film in their community, and then they get all of the benefits of production costs and visibility for their community, et cetera. And usually what happens is they have a diversity goal, but it's never enforced. So, or maybe it's just catering, that comes under that diversity clause. You have to have more specific, and there has to be accountability. And if they do not meet the terms of the tax credit requirements, then they need to have that tax credit removed. And that has never happened. And so that's an important part of what has to happen. We're also looking at the Department of Labor has an apprenticeship program that has about $100 million in there. And what it is it's many of these jobs, especially behind the camera and below the line, are jobs that are very high-paying, middle-class jobs. The lighting, gaffers, makeup, special effects. All of these jobs are very high-paying, well-paid jobs. They're union jobs, and you learn them on you learn them on the job. So these apprenticeship programs, if they get approved, because you have to submit the curriculum for it, then it pays the employer, and it pays the apprentice for about 18 months to learn that craft. And then that creates the opportunity for them to work in this field. And so working again with Congressman Castro and the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, we're looking at both of those issues to basically insist that the local and state tax credits be applied, and the requirements must be met before the tax credit is given. And the apprenticeships, that the programs are written and curriculum is developed so that people can learn those jobs below the line, but above the line as well. So the directing programs, the director of photography, all of those parts, even the casting roles. I mean, all of these are jobs that people fall into, and then they kind of learn them, but they're jobs that you can't start unless you apprentice for them. And that's a good way of creating an on-ramp to the industry.
Hi, I'm over here. Yo soy Leticia Colón de Mejías. Thank you. This is an incredible presentation. I think that the data and information that you have presented is just phenomenal and moving. I grew up in a time when there were no Spanish people on television, and I remember being a fourth grader in class, and it was Black History Month, and I remember raising my hand and asking my teacher what month was Brown People Month. And I actually got sent to the principal's office and got in trouble. She thought I was being flippant, but I just actually wondered when Brown People Month was going to happen. Mm-hmm. This was before Hispanic Heritage Month was even a thing, you know? But I wonder, because what I find is I agree that all of the characters that we play on television and in the film are negative connotation characters, with the exception of maybe J-Lo gets a few, high quality roles. And I remember when she became a fly girl on In Living Color, being so excited that a Latina was on TV and all she was doing was dancing. So how do we turn the tide, even here in Connecticut on public television, to highlight Latinas or Latinos in roles that are real roles of, CEOs, roles of, people who are leaders in their communities, real roles that are contextualized, that show people that we are humans and we are successful, and there are many of us in our communities that are making large impacts?
That's such a good question, because you've got Sofia Vergara, who is the highest paid, actor in television. and her role is comedic, and so I mean, who? She's making all this money. She's got to be doing something right. I mean, but it's not the role that you're talking about. On the other hand, Jimmy Smits played, a congressman from Houston who runs for the presidency against the Alan Alda character, and ultimately the show ends where he wins the presidency. So it took us through, through that whole arc, and we were able to see, him there. We were able to see shows like NYPD Blue, where, they were the authority figures trying to do right and, save the world, in New York, basically, the crime fighters as police detectives. So we have some of those roles, and we have, Nicholas Gonzalez, who's on the Good Doctor. And he's the number 2 on the call list, which is the second most important role in the show. And Nicholas, who was from San Antonio, went to Stanford undergraduate, and I think he went to Oxford after Stanford, just to show you that the talent and the education and the training is there, but it's the roles that again are the criminal, the gangbanger, this is what we, wind up seeing so often.
The question I have is, how do we create this disruption, right? Where else in the field have we seen disruption in a way where perhaps we can finance, right, our own productions, where we can begin to blend this piece that Yvette was lifting up of how do we create new models of integrated culture and visioning for our young people?
Yeah.
Because they're quite frankly tired,
Yes.
right, of the ones that they've been seeing. And they have ideas of their own, of how they see themselves. So what have we learned, for example, from our African American brothers and sisters who have created their own production companies, who have started to finance their own kind of pathways, and where is there room for us to band together and do some of that?
Oh, that's such a good question. I mean, part of it is that, we're always thinking that we should create a system outside of the system. And that is just never going to happen, because the system is what you have to be a part of. You have to integrate into that system. And so the question is, how do we create on-ramps to get in there, and how do we get them to listen to these things? Well, YouTube has been a big game changer. And many of the YouTube stars are minorities, because they find an audience that resonates with what they're seeing. So, I mean, and some of it may seem, kind of vacuous, but it's, the kids relate to it. So you've got, young men, young boys and girls who are makeup artists, who, you watch these videos and, it's like you can see why they're enticing, and they keep you going and coming back. It's short content, it's affordable content, and many of them are learning how to use, software systems that are very, I find them, I would never be able to do it. But they master this, and they basically are cutting their own little mini films. And so, that's the beauty of what young people are doing. Now, I also do not encourage young people to think that because you've seen somebody who was successful, that you should spend all of your time now trying to become a video star when you've got like 20 or people who are following you. And that is just, it's a balancing act about what's reasonable. And some people that have this knack that can, and not everybody can duplicate that. So it's a catch-22. But I think that the most important thing is that, why shouldn't we be a part of the mainstream? Why shouldn't we be a part of major studios? Why shouldn't we be a part of networks? Why do we have to think about being the independent route where, young kids take their credit cards and their parents' credit cards and they max out and they do one small project for an independent project that they submit to film festivals as a short, and then they're $25,000 in debt, because they spent everything, and then what happens to the next project? So the most important thing is education. You know, go to a film school, you know, get the credential, you know, learn what you're doing and do it well. And under those auspices, take every opportunity that's available to you to create under those circumstances, because it's basically you're underwriting, that program is underwriting your projects. But that is the most important part. There's so many young people who, you know, they have a camera and they want to do a short and they want to do a film and they have this, and they just, the two things are a disconnect. You know, I mean, there's one thing that, you know, everyone in this room knows is that without hard work, you just don't get there. There's just no easy way around. There's no circuitous way. I mean, there's no pathway to what you want, and basically eat ice cream and, you know, sleep in every day and, you know, watch TV. I mean, it's hard work, and there's a period in your life in which you just have to focus on what you want to do. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everyone.